Hello, you magnificent bastards! Glad you tuned in. Why is it that the most outspoken people are often the ones with the least understanding of an issue? This is Computing Forever. He had some beef with Sargon of Akkad, another YouTuber, and decided to make a video on why Sargon actually is a Marxist. So today we'll be talking about this understanding of Marxism. Computing Forever, this really is not meant as a personal attack or anything. Maybe you are a fantastic person and you really know your shit and just dropped the ball in this video, but you really did get quite a few things really wrong about Marxism. So in this video I'm gonna be talking about the first, I think it's 9 minutes or 7 minutes of your video, where you basically just outline a little bit about Marxism and your issue with Sargon of Akkad. So let's take a look at what exactly you did get wrong.
And these are atheists with a laser beam-like rational focus when it comes to debating the existence of God. They're brilliant. They're right up there. But they have adopted another religion by drinking the Kool-Aid of feminism. Feminism is now their religion. And I'm going to draw a similar comparison now between them and Carl Benjamin's thinking, because Carl, you are also an embarrassed believer. All right, your Marxism, okay, is economic Marxism.
I'll admit that this one is rather nitpicky, but economic Marxism doesn't exist. The term is only being used in a really vague, somewhat slangy context to denote differences between, for instance, political Marxism and economic, or rather classic Marxism. But again, the term doesn't really exist outside of this vague context and is often used only on the internet. And I know this is nitpicking, but we have to be precise when talking about these issues. Also, this really is the reason why I'm doing this response in the first place. Unironically, using the term economic Marxism really is a red flag for someone who's really not all that familiar with Marxist thought. And if said person makes a video to educate people on Marxism, well, yeah, that makes me rather unhappy. Also, full disclosure here, there is the term Marxian economics or Marxist economics, which basically is the subset of Marxist thought concerned specifically with economics, but that's a whole different thing. That is basically what Marx had to say on economics specifically.
And I'm going to draw a similar comparison with them and Carl Benjamin, because Carl, as you know, is one of the very best in this anti-feminist, rationalist, skeptical community of ours here on YouTube. And he very brilliantly calls out Marxist feminism for what it is. And yet, he is committing all of the same cardinal sins that Marxist feminists commit. His thinking is exactly the same as a feminist SJW. Marxism is Marxism is Marxism. It behaves the same way no matter what you apply it to.
So, wait a minute. If everything is the same, essentially, why did you specifically call Sargon an economic Marxist then? Doesn't make all that much sense to me. Besides, there are fundamental differences between various Marxist ideologies. For instance, in classic Marxism, culture is comparably less important. Classic Marxism separates the world into two big thought structures, essentially. First, the basis, which is the material realities, resources and the like. And on top of that, the superstructure, the social construction lying on top of it, culture, institutions, arts. And in Marxist thought, the basis determines how the superstructure looks. And only by changing the basis can you permanently, effectively change the superstructure. In a lot of modern Marxist variations, which we would commonly call cultural Marxism, even though I kinda dislike the term, this is essentially flipped over. Only through a change in the superstructure will we be able to achieve a change in the foundation. Those two lines of thought are completely opposite, which is also why so many hardcore old-school Marxists have such a disdain for nowadays special snowflakes. So, if I understood what you were saying, right? Then you are wrong. Sorry.
Whether it's feminism or economic Marxism or what I'm affectionately calling Sargonism, okay? This is his planned economy. Whether he likes it or not, that is what he is ultimately proposing.
And suddenly you throw in the term planned economy. That's not necessarily Marxist at all. That could be socialist. It also could be state capitalist or any other number of things. A planned economy in Marxism theoretically is only desired in the transitional stages between capitalism, socialism, and communism. After that, the economy is meant to be completely handed over to the people. Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, for instance, has this to say on what is to happen after the planned economy. When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Of course, the Communist Manifesto also talks about a somewhat nasty and brutish dispossession of the capitalists and the concentration of the economy, but that really is just a transitional stage in their understanding. Whether or not we like that is up to us, you know?
Proposing, and it doesn't matter how many times he says, I'm completely against communism, that's the last thing I want, the outcome of his new measures would ultimately result in a communist society.
Right, how do I put this? No. A communist society is something very, very specific in its nature, and to understand it, you have to understand the core elements of Marxism. So let's go over those real quick here. A. The belief in a primal society of mankind, where everyone is essentially equal. This idea of a natural state of mankind is really central throughout the history of political thought. You have ideas of a really negative natural state that warrants and necessitates the rule of law, according to people like Hobbes, for instance.
Thomas Hobbes wrote a book that he called Leviathan, a state of war with every man against every other man, and in the state we're miserable.
What does Hobbes say?
The natural state of man is a state of war in which we would all kill each other without an absolute ruler.
What does Hobbes say?
Every man against every man, every man against every man, every man against every man.
What does Hobbes say?
Nasty, nasty, brute ashore. Nasty, nasty, brute ashore. Nasty, nasty, brute ashore.
What does Hobbes say?
And then you have ideas of a very positive natural state of mankind that has become corrupted by social influences over time, according to, for instance, Rousseau. B. The belief in a dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed that does change form over history, from slavery, for instance, to feudalism, but the mechanisms essentially and the idea of it remains the same. C. Historical determinism. There is an endpoint to which human history is striving to, and this is because of the history of class struggle that essentially both accelerated and directed human history. D. The understanding of the world as a material resource basis and a cultural social superstructure. And E. All of that culminating in a communist society, meaning a society that after going through all those predetermined periods in history, returning to a primal society-like state. A society where the dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed is finally broken. A society that reached the final point of Marxist historical determinism. And a society where the basis was finally changed to achieve all of this. I have never heard Sargon arguing for a primal society or Urgesellschaft, never heard him talk about oppression as a dichotomy, never heard him claim to be a historical determinist, and never heard him claim a final return to the natural state of mankind. So I don't see how Sargon can possibly be labeled Marxist in this context. And even then, you should have explained this in your video. You cannot assume a layperson to know this stuff.
And along the way, he will draw all the same false conclusions that Marxists do. So Marxism looks at the world and says, for example, the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, are simply oppressing the working class by dint of being wealthy.
No. The bourgeoisie are oppressing the proletariat because they control the means of production, and as such, the proletariat is forced to sell their labor without essentially and very broadly and somewhat wrongly said receiving the full compensation for their labor, essentially selling their labor under value, and the bourgeoisie is profiting without supplying productive labor. Well, at least in Marxist thought. Again, I'm not arguing for this myself, this is just what Marxism is. Listen, computing forever, right now you are completely and utterly missing the point of Marxism. You really should brush up on Marxist theory if you want to make videos on it. And just to be clear here, I am not arguing in favor of Marxism here. In fact, I am on your side in all of this. The problem here is that if you want to beat an opponent, you have to first understand that opponent.
Okay, the working class are just, their labor is a form of enslavement, it's serfdom.
Right. Let me pull up the Communist Manifesto real quick. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. You are, again, completely conflating terminology and mixing everything vitally together without really making all that much sense. In Marxist theory, a serf and a member of the modern proletariat are, while being incarnations of the same phenomenon essentially, separated by a whole system in Marxist understanding, and the type of their exploitation is completely different. One is exploited by being owned, the other is being exploited by selling their labor in bad conditions. This might sound like nitpicking, but what you essentially just did was saying that a boat and a car are the same because they transport people. We have to be precise.
They're being exploited, and the rich are simply profiteering. Profit is basically theft. This is exactly the same as feminists saying that all men are oppressing all women under the system of patriarchy and men have male privilege.
And this is exactly why we need to be precise. No, it's not the same. One is based on labor value theory, where the capitalist is exploiting the productive labor of the proletariat. The other is based on cultural hegemony and dominance and has literally nothing to do with productive labor. They are concerned with certain hierarchical structures in society and in culture. They really don't deal at all with the exploitation of productive labor. This is what I've been talking about earlier. Marxism does not equal Marxism.
And then there's a bunch of other bad ideas that come tacked on with that. You know, the belief in rape culture, the belief in the gender pay gap.
I don't really know what you mean by belief in gender pay gap. Maybe you mean the belief that it's caused by sexism. Either way, just to be sure here, the gender wage gap is real. I have a video on it here, so feel free to check it out. If you can't be bothered, here's the gist of the gender pay gap. The unadjusted aggregate wage gap in the United States right now is somewhere around 20%. If you start accounting for life decisions, such as getting children or getting married, stuff like that, that wage gap shrinks to 3 to 8%, depending on paper. The more life decisions you start accounting for, the smaller the gap becomes. But to this day, there is a small one-digit remainder. The likelihood of that remainder in its entirety being caused by sexism is somewhere around 0. If you want to, I have the most up-to-date paper on the gender wage gap in the description.
That's for fucking sure. It only suits Karl to argue against Marxism when it's in the form of feminism, something he doesn't agree with. But when it's something that he believes, he's all in favor of Marxism, as you can see with this tweet. All right, this is this tweet he put out just shortly after our discussion. So the tweet reads as follows: Marx's analysis wasn't wrong, his proposed solutions were.
And this is exactly why I think that Twitter is a shitty platform. What part of his analysis? Are we talking about the philosophical basis of Marxism? Are we talking about Marxist understanding of wages and profits? Are we talking about historical determinism or materialism? As long as Sargon doesn't specify what exactly he means, well, tough luck, I guess. Because Marx, whether you emotionally like it or not, did make quite a few very good points regarding economics, for instance, and his understanding of social realities being the reflection of material realities arguably make much more sense than the dominant ideas of his time that basically argued the other way around. So I really don't see where the problem here is. Just because someone says that something you don't like has something good about it doesn't mean the person is what you don't like. I mean, in the end, even the Islamic State can have a good point. Even Hitler can have a good point. So having this emotional, ideological reaction to someone defending something that Marx might have done well, I don't think that's a good idea, man. I think you can do better.
So taking the first part of that, they were absolutely wrong. I mean, with all Marxist analysis, people have the causality ass backwards. They look at the end product and they believe that this entire system must have been as a result of some sort of manipulation, some sort of exploitation of somebody. This is all set up to look this way.
Okay, man, I get that you might not be versed in depth about Marxism, but in almost all classic Marxist frameworks and in what is called orthodox Marxism, which basically is the agreed upon doctrine of the socialists at the Second Internationale, the base determines the superstructure. Period. Right now, you have your interpretation the wrong way. While the superstructure does influence the basis, the material realities, the base determines the superstructure. This is absolutely central to Marxism, and if you miss this point, I think you are completely missing the point of Marxism. The rest of the video then deals with the stream with Sargon that triggered all of this in the first place, and if you want to, it's linked in the description. I really wanted only to deal with the first, I think, 7 or 9 minutes, the beginning essentially where Computing Forever is talking about Marxism, because I think that really needed clarification, because again, you cannot expect a layperson to know all of this, and if you give them those wrong information, then yeah, dude, I don't think that's a good idea. So, Computing Forever, I understand and appreciate what you are trying to do, and I bet that you actually are a sensible, decent person, so please don't take this video as a personal attack. I just think that you really dropped the ball when it comes to properly understanding, and more than that, explaining Marxism. And we sadly don't have the luxury to do that. Marxism is actually an extremely complicated and convoluted issue that you can only begin to understand if you deal with its philosophical, economical, social and cultural aspects. You seem to be vitally conflating terminologies that really don't have much to do with each other, and your actual explanations of Marxism are really vague and completely miss the point. To me, it really looks like you fell for what we call Kneipen Marxism, or in English, pub Marxism. A really watered down, cherry-picked version of Marxism you either complain about or argue for with your friends while being in a pub and being absolutely shit-faced. I'm Dr. Layman, glad you tuned in, and as always, Babylon prevails.
This is a shallow, superficial analysis of a situation.